and welcome to our fourth episode of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we'll be taking a look at the fourth episode of Frasier, entitled I Hate Frasier Crane. This episode originally aired October 7th, 1993. It attracted 24.2 million viewers, a drop of 1.5 million viewers from the previous episode, and nearly 4 million from the pilot episode. By contrast, Seinfeld's ratings this season have actually gone up from the season premiere and barely dropped from the previous week, coming in at 28.4 million viewers. 400,000 viewers higher than Frasier has pulled on even its highest rated episode so far. That's not to say Frasier is doing bad at this point. Again, it ends up being NBC's second highest rated scripted show of the year, only behind the aforementioned Seinfeld. And it is still very much finding its audience at this point. It is also worth noting that for the 1993-1994 broadcast year, Frasier aired rerun episodes on Sunday nights following the NBA games, whereas Seinfeld didn't have repeats of its show at any time during the regular broadcast. This episode is written by Christopher Lloyd. More on him in a second. But I need to make a quick correction from the last episode here. The third episode was written by Ann Flett and Chuck Randberg. For some reason, IMDb decided to put creator credits before the writer credits on the writer line, which is what led me to incorrectly credit the creators with the writing of the last episode. This team will again work on the seventh episode, so we'll give them their due when we get there. Anyway, before you get too excited about the Christopher Lloyd who wrote this episode, this isn't Doc Brown, and this isn't the mad scientist from the Tremors TV series. This Lloyd is actually best known as a producer at the time, having had a large influence on the last 2 seasons of Wings, and being a writer for 6 episodes of it. Lloyd acts as an executive producer for the first 7 seasons of Frasier, and then he also returns to executive produce the last season. He'll go on to write another 17 episodes of the show, and he has a production credit for a total of 191 episodes out of the 263 episode run. The wild thing is, after this, he went on to write the Hugh Jackman, Ian McKellen 2006 superhero tale Flushed Away, before becoming the creator and showrunner for another popular sitcom that in every way was just slightly less successful than Frasier. This show was Modern Family. Both series ran for 11 seasons, racked up double-digit Emmy wins, 22 for Modern Family and 37 for Frasier, hit over 200 episodes, 250 for Modern Family and 263 for Frasier. They actually would have tied if it wasn't for the dwindling series count that's happened in recent years. And despite both being widely popular, neither series ever managed to hit the number 1 spot on their respective networks. With Lloyd on writing duties for this episode, the direction fell to David Lee, who I'm sure you'll recognize as one of the series' executive producers and writers. This isn't Lee's first directorial effort, but it is one of his earliest. Prior to this, he directed a few episodes of Wings, and that's about it. Following this, he would go on to direct another 40 episodes of Frasier, as well as a single episode of the criminally underwatched Stark Raving Mad, starring Tony Shalhoub, Eddie McClintock, and Neil Patrick Harris. Currently, you can find VHS rips of the entire series on YouTube, and even though the resolution isn't great, it's well worth your time to give this series a watch. This episode opens with the return of the red blinking light on top of the Space Needle. This is our first repeat intro of the series. I wonder if we'll get the yellow elevator again in the next episode. It would be interesting if we only get 3 of our 20-odd intros in the first season. Our opening scene is in Frasier's apartment, featuring him having dinner with Martin, Daphne, and Niles. Maris couldn't make it this time because she was upset talking to the operator on directory assistance. The big joke in this opening scene, and easily my favorite joke of this episode, involves staring by the Crane brothers during their father's dinner prayer. I really like that Martin prays for the meal. It's another fine detail to help round out the character. This scene again builds on Niles' crush on Daphne, established during the last episode. I'm not sure if she's totally oblivious to it at this point, but she plays the airhead well enough. Also, we have more Eddie in this episode than in the last one. Again, the main joke with Eddie is he stares at Frasier. And we get a nice subversion of this later in the episode, where even Eddie is so ashamed of Frasier's actions he won't look at him. Even being slightly repetitive, Eddie is still cute, and the jokes still land 4 episodes in. This opening scene introduces us to our A-plot, which involves Frasier's rivalry with Derek Mann, who writes the Man Around Town column for the Seattle Times. Mann is played by Joe Mantegna. I suppose Mantegna could also be considered a guest caller for this episode, as we don't actually see his face, but he feels more like a bona fide guest voice to me. Mantegna is probably best known for playing the role of Will Girardi in Joan of Arcadia and voicing Fat Tony on The Simpsons. An interesting fact about The Simpsons, Kelsey Grammer also voiced a recurring character on The Simpsons, that of Sideshow Bob, who has a brother and father who show up in a few episodes. And when they show up, do you know who they're voiced by? You guessed it, Mahoney and Pierce. The second scene is our guest caller scene. The guest caller this episode is Judith Ivey. She plays a woman who keeps getting other calls while Frasier tries to talk to her. Out of the guest callers we've had thus far, she's by far the one I'm least familiar with. She's done a lot of the "that girl from that thing" roles. But interestingly, whereas most of these actors seem to tend towards one-off appearances in procedurals, she's gone for a lot more made-for-TV movies roles. She's had recurring roles in 5 different shows, of which I'd only heard of 2, and only have had actual exposure to 1. They are Down Home, The 5 Mrs. Buchanans, The Accidental Wolf, Designing Women, and The Critic. The last 2 are the only ones I had some familiarity with, and not enough to have a real opinion on her acting range. She did a fine job with the role in this episode, but that's as far as my opinion on her goes. This episode also features the first scene with Roz outside of the studio, and her first scene with someone other than Frasier. Her and Frasier are at the coffee shop when Niles shows up. At the end of the last episode, I gave Niles and Frasier some credit on being self-aware. I may have to retract that with this episode. Niles has apparently met Roz off screen a few times, but he has no idea who she is. And I feel like the next time they meet, he won't remember who she is either. I actually like this for a character beat for Niles, as from the start he struck me as a more competent, but also more stuck-up psychiatrist than Frasier. The waiter in this scene is Dean Erickson. He actually played a waiter in the second episode, and will show up 2 more times before the end of the season. These are the only roles in anything he ever plays, as he stops acting shortly after this, but it is a nice bit of continuity between episodes. We also get our first bona fide B-plot of the series in this episode. Sort of. It doesn't get any actual resolution, but we have a couple fun scenes with Daphne and Martin working together on a cold case Martin took with him from his time in the police force. It made me think a lot of the later Bosch books after he's retired from the force and is working on his old cases. Daphne uses what seem like actual psychic powers to help Martin a little. Never enough to actually solve the case, mind you, and Daphne even accurately predicts a few things. In Cheers, Carla's psychic is revealed to be a fraud in one of the later seasons. I'm really hoping they don't do anything like that with Daphne here. If the writers let her actually be a little psychic, or leave it vague enough it could go either way, it keeps her far more interesting and a better foil for the Crane brothers. We get a few new shots of the coffee shop from the outside in this episode. One is a really nice shot of Niles, Martin, and Daphne watching from the window. This is the same window Frasier was sitting in front of in the second episode. And the second is from the front door of the coffee shop. Cheers had some inconsistencies with its exterior windows, so it's good to see some more spatial awareness here. Martin's detective friend in this episode is played by John Brandon. Brandon is another one of those actors that falls into the "that guy who was in that thing" field. He's sort of ended up typecast. A huge percentage of the roles he played was that of either a cop or a detective. The longest running role he had was in 50-odd episodes of the soap opera The Brave and the Bold. The Bold and the Beautiful. The only description I can find of his character in that show is that he was a patriarch figure to one of the regular cast members. My initial assumption was he was a retired cop, based on this picture from the Bold and the Beautiful wiki page, but upon further research, it turns out this photo isn't even from the Bold and the Beautiful. It's his IMDb headshot, and a still from an episode of the 1977 series The Hardy Boys' Nancy Drew Mysteries, which ran for 3 seasons and I somehow never even knew existed until now. This is the only episode of Frasier Brandon will appear in. When he leaves at the end of the episode, he invites Martin to come with him. I can't help but hope we get to see Martin go on some actual cop-related adventures at some point in the series. Outside the coffee shop, while Frasier is preparing for his fight, a mariachi band begins playing. The song they are playing is Cielito Lindo. Probably not pronouncing that correctly. It is a Mexican love song, popularized in 1882. The title is roughly translated as Lovely Sweet One. The lyrics are pretty much exactly what you'd expect to be in a Mexican love song from the 1800s. Our Coda scene from this episode is perfection. I've been a little worried about Eddie only having one joke, but oh my gosh, this is just such a perfect Coda. It's equal parts funny, cute, and could have just as easily functioned as a cold open. Actually, now that I'm saying it, I think that would be an interesting way for the Coda scenes to work going forward, as a cold open, except at the end of the episode. Sort of like Troy and Abed did in the early seasons of Community. This episode has the most ties out of any episode thus far in it. Frasier and Niles both sport 3 different ties in this episode. This brings both brothers up to a total of 9 ties each worn in the show thus far. All 3 of Frasier's ties in this episode are red or maroonish. The first one is seen in the studio and has a nice yellow design. The second is red, and I initially thought was the same tie as in the last one, but it is slightly lighter color and has a different design for sure. The last tie Frasier wears, he takes off just before his fight. It is red with tan strike lines through it. Niles' 3 ties are much more visually interesting in this episode. He has a green one, a yellow one, and a red one. The green pattern is a little bit boring, but both the olive-style design on the yellow tie and the swirling radar-type pattern on the red tie are very nice. The yellow one is easily my favorite of the episode. There are 2 little goofs worth mentioning in this episode. The opening scene features Eddie staring at Frasier while he plays piano. But as soon as Frasier stands up, the camera cuts wide and Eddie has vanished. The other error occurs when Martin is talking about his cold case. He says the murder happened 20 years ago when Frasier was 12. That would make Frasier 32 in 1993, and only 23 when he first showed up in the 3rd season of Cheers. Frasier's generally accepted birth year is circa 1952, making him around 41, or maybe 42 at the time of this episode, and 22, not 12, 20 years ago. I think this is most easily explained away by assuming that the murder happened 30 years ago and Martin just misspoke, as it fits nicely with the Frasier being born in 1952 timeline. Overall, this is another good episode of Frasier. It isn't quite as great as the last episode, but it's still very enjoyable. It's a solid 8 out of 10. Give it a shot. Even if you hate Frasier Crane. Maybe especially then.